Welcome to the story of one of the most disturbing cases in the history of rural Vermont. Please leave a comment about where you are watching from and when you first heard this story before we start. We want to know where and when these documented accounts come in. It was 1920, and Oakville, a small town in the rolling hills of Vermont, was still recovering from a world war and a terrible pandemic. Most people had lost someone to war, illness, or the mass exodus that happened after the economy got bad. This is where our story starts, not with screams or violence, but with silence. The strange silence that surrounded the Montgomery funeral home, which stood at the edge of town like a guard between the living and the dead. Sutton and Vivian Montgomery did not grow up in Oakville. In the spring of 1919, they arrived and bought the town's only funeral home from Wilbur Harrison, who had buried 3 generations of Oakville residents. The Montgomerys came with perfect references, the right licenses, and the kind of serious respect that people who prepare the dead should have. Sutton was tall and thin, and his hands looked too big for his thin body. Vivian was the opposite, small, with hands and eyes that never seemed to blink when they should, according to town records. The Montgomery Funeral Home was a Victorian building with dark green shutters and a strange architectural feature. It was located on Willow Street. The basement of the building could be seen from the street, making it look like a house that didn't want to fully come out of the ground. This was where the preparation room was. Its small rectangular windows at ground level were always covered with thick curtains, no matter what time of year it was. The couple lived on the top floor, showed people around on the main floor, and worked on their craft in the basement. It was a smart plan that was common in the field. The Oakville Historical Society later found that it wasn't common for people to join the community as quickly as the Montgomerys did, even though they acted polite and distant. Josephine Merritt said in a 1958 oral history recording that is kept at the Vermont State Archives, "They were there, but never quite there. They'd go to every community event, but only talk when someone else did. They would look you in the eye, but it would seem like they were looking at something just beyond you. It wasn't bad, but it was strange." Tax records from 1919 showed the first strange thing about the Montgomerys. Their business was successful right away, which is unusual for new businesses in a small town where families usually used the same funeral services for generations. In just 6 months, the Montgomerys had held more funerals than Harrison had in the last 2 years of his business. Records show that they charged less than the average in the area, but their income was higher than expected. During a courthouse renovation in 1962, the town clerk's personal diary was found. It said that the funeral home ordered strange amounts of preservation chemicals, enough for twice as many bodies as they usually handled. The Montgomerys had a strange way of doing business that went unnoticed at first, then was talked about quietly, and finally became their trademark. They took pictures of the dead, not just the usual memorial photos from that time period, but also many pictures at different stages of the preparation process. It was for the families, Sutton would say in his calm, formal way, a record of how we cared for their loved ones. 3 different sources say that these pictures were not often shared with family members. When asked about this difference, Vivian would smile, her tight smile, and say that most families found it too hard to deal with more pictures, but that keeping them was important for their professional standards. In August 1920, the Montgomerys' business was first really disturbed. A sudden summer storm caused the roof of the old mill to fall in, killing Ezekiel Palmer, a well-respected farmer whose family had lived in Oakville since it was founded. Even the best morticians had a hard time with his body, which was so badly crushed that it was hard to tell what it was. Dr. Augustus Reynolds, the town doctor who declared Palmer dead at the scene, said Sutton Montgomery reacted in an unusual way when he saw the body. "Doctor, I've seen a lot of men die in medical school and in practice," Reynolds wrote to his brother in Boston, and the letter was found decades later. Funeral directors usually keep a professional distance, not cold but measured. Montgomery didn't blink at the horrible sight, which is what you would expect. The look that passed between him and his wife was unexpected. It wasn't sadness, shock, or even a professional opinion. It was excitement. The lights in the basement of the Montgomery funeral home stayed on all night for 3 days. They got ice delivered twice a day, which was strange because they had just put in new cooling systems. Mabel Duncan, the town's telephone operator, said she heard bits and pieces of a lot of long-distance calls Vivian made to medical supply companies in Boston and New York. The next weekend, Palmer's closed casket funeral took place. Something amazing happened that many people would later say was the moment when people's views of the Montgomerys began to change. They had done what many thought was impossible, making Palmer's broken face look calm and whole. The reconstruction was so good that Palmer's widow insisted on an open casket, even though the Montgomerys had surprisingly suggested that it be closed. Palmer's sister's voice could be heard across the quiet parlor saying, "He looks like he's just sleeping. How did you do this? It's a miracle." The miracle, though, didn't happen to the rest of the body, which stayed covered. Ezekiel's widow would later tell her sister something troubling after kissing her husband's forehead goodbye. His skin didn't feel right. Not like skin at all. Oakville residents noticed a change in the Montgomerys' behavior not long after the Palmer funeral. They had been polite and kept their distance, but now they were starting to feel confident, almost happy. They started having small events at the funeral home, which they said were for community outreach, but only certain people were invited. Usually the town's most important people, or those who had just lost a family member. During these private parties, which took place in the formal parlor where the dead were usually displayed, guests drank tea from delicate china cups, while Sutton talked about everything from modern embalming methods to ancient Egyptian methods of preserving bodies. Vivian, on the other hand, would move around with a silver tray of small, perfectly cut sandwiches, her movements smooth and efficient. Harriet Pembroke, who went to one of these gatherings in September 1920 after her father died, said, "The conversations always came back to death, not in a creepy way, but with an artist's understanding of the process." Sutton once said that preservation is like taking a picture that lasts forever, which is how my husband talks about photography. Pembroke didn't realize how right the photography comparison was. The Montgomerys had a lot of photographic equipment, including cameras, specialized lenses, lighting equipment, and darkroom chemicals, according to inventory records found in 1963. This suggests that they were running a serious studio rather than just taking memorial portraits. The Montgomerys' reputation as professionals grew throughout the fall of 1920. People wanted their services more and more, not just in Oakville, but also in nearby towns. They hired Pearl Jenkins as an assistant. He was a quiet man with a medical background who couldn't finish his training to become a doctor because of the war. Jenkins lived in a small apartment above the carriage house behind the funeral home. People knew he worked strange hours. Later, Jenkins would be an important witness, but at first, the Oakville sheriff didn't take his statements seriously because they sounded like the ramblings of a disturbed mind. His story only became believable when there was physical proof. The sheriff's report, which was filed but later taken off the official record, said that Jenkins went to the police after seeing what he called unnatural things happening in the preparation room. A copy of the report was found in Deputy Walter Crane's personal belongings in 1955. "They don't just keep them safe," Jenkins is said to have said. "They change them in ways that aren't right, and the pictures aren't for records. They're trophies that show what they've done." Sheriff Martin Sullivan is said to have told the deputy to take Jenkins's next statement off the official record because it was so disturbing. The current document only vaguely talks about manipulation of the deceased beyond professional necessity and creation of permanent art pieces through specialized chemical treatments. The Montgomerys got the body of Matilda Grayson, an old widow who had died peacefully in her sleep, on the 10th of December 1920. This was the turning point. Her nephew, Herbert Grayson, who was a bank manager in Burlington and had come back to take care of her affairs, made a specific request. Since Matilda had always been proud of her hands, she had been a great pianist, he wanted a picture of them to remember her by. Sutton Montgomery politely said no, saying that they only took pictures of the face for memorial purposes. When Grayson kept pushing, even offering to pay more, the funeral director got unusually flustered. Grayson later said that Vivian stepped in smoothly and offered to take a simple picture of Matilda's face instead for free. Grayson went back to the funeral home after hours because he was unhappy and getting more and more suspicious. His sworn testimony, which he gave from a hospital bed on December 11, tells us what happened next. Grayson said that he walked through an unlocked side door and down to the basement preparation room where he thought he would find his aunt's body being prepared for the funeral the next day. Instead, what he found would start an investigation that revealed the true nature of the Montgomerys' business. Instead of the usual clinical lights, the preparation room was lit by photography lamps, arranged in an artistic way. Matilda Grayson's body was on the central table, but Grayson said it was set up in a theatrical way. She was sitting up straight with hidden supports, her head was tilted at a graceful angle, and her face was changed to one of calm thought. Most disturbing of all, her hands, the very thing her nephew had wanted to remember, had been changed. Grayson said, "They were no longer my aunt's hands. Somehow, the fingers had been made longer, more elegant, and more expressive. They didn't look like people anymore. The walls of the room, which are usually bare, had been changed for the photo shoot. There was dark fabric behind the subject, which Grayson recognized from his own interest in amateur photography as a portrait studio setting. But what made him run away in fear, which made neighbors call the sheriff, was what he saw in a partially open cabinet near the darkroom door. Dozens of photo albums, each carefully labeled with names and dates. The sheriff's raid on the Montgomery funeral home in the early morning hours of the 12th of December, 1920, showed everything the couple had been doing. Before being filed with the county clerk, the official report was heavily edited. It said that more than 20 albums of photos that showed the Montgomerys' work since they moved to Oakville were found. Each album told the story of a change, from being dead to what the Montgomerys called the perfected form in their private notes. The photos showed a disturbing trend. The first pictures showed the people as they came to the funeral home looking natural in death and showing all the signs that life was ending. Later pictures showed different steps in Montgomery's work, such as changing the structure of facial features, using chemicals to change the quality of the skin, and using positioning techniques to make poses that were not natural but were very striking. The last photo in each series showed the finished works. The dead people had been changed into idealized versions of themselves, with looks and expressions that they had never had in life. These last pictures were printed bigger than the others and put on heavy cardstock with gold edges. The most terrifying thing was finding the subcellar, which wasn't on any official building plans and could only be reached through a secret door in the floor of the main preparation room. The Montgomerys had kept some of the best specimens from their 2 years of operation in a climate-controlled room with glass-fronted cabinets. They had made what were basically human sculptures by using a unique preservation method that combined traditional embalming with chemical treatments based on taxidermy and museum conservation methods. These were the remains of certain people that they thought had undergone the most successful transformations. The coroner who looked at these remains said that a process had changed a lot of the tissue in the bodies, keeping their shape but changing their texture. This is why Ezekiel Palmer's widow said that his skin didn't feel right. The Montgomerys were caught at a train station in White River Junction, where they were apparently trying to get to Canada. They didn't fight back, and the arresting officers said they acted the same way they did in Oakville, which was calm. They only asked to bring a leather-bound book, which was taken as evidence and later identified as a journal that explained their methods and beliefs. The journal, parts of which were read at their closed trial, showed the disturbing way they thought about what they did. The Montgomerys didn't see themselves as funeral directors. They saw themselves as artists, working in a field that other people were afraid to try. They thought they were freeing the dead from the bad design choices of nature and the problems of life, making art that would last forever and show human beauty in its best form. Sutton wrote in an entry from April 1919, "The dead are our canvas. Their families give them to us, thinking that we are only delaying the inevitable decay for a few days of viewing. They don't get that we offer something much better, true permanence and true perfection. We free our subjects from the imperfect bodies they lived in, and give them the perfect bodies they deserve." The Montgomerys' case was especially disturbing to those who studied it because they showed no remorse or understanding that what they had done was wrong. During the trial, they kept the calm, professional demeanor that had won over the people of Oakvale in the first place. They talked about their art with the pride of skilled craftsmen, and they seemed genuinely confused by how shocked people were by their work. Vivian said, "We made them better," during one of the few times she spoke directly to the court. "We gave them beauty and a place to stay. They were normal people in life. They became amazing in our hands. Isn't that what art is supposed to do?" Doctor was interested in this lack of normal human empathy. Lucius Harmon was a psychiatrist who looked at both Montgomerys before they were sentenced. In his secret report, which was kept secret until 1966 and then partially published in the Vermont Medical Journal, he said that they had a profound perversion of the aesthetic sense and almost no normal moral constraints. They don't see the human body as sacred or as the place where a person's identity lives, Dr. Harmon said, but as raw material clay to be molded, marble to be sculpted. They think they have not harmed the dead, but have raised them up. This marks a fundamental departure from the ethical principles that dictate the treatment of human remains in civilized society. The Montgomery trial was short and mostly happened behind closed doors. The judge sealed all testimony and evidence for 40 years, saying that the crimes were so bad and never seen before that they were morally wrong. The couple was found guilty of several counts of desecrating human remains and cheating the grieving. Sutton was sent to Vermont State Prison, and Vivian was sent to the Vermont State Hospital for the criminally insane. They will spend the rest of their lives in prison. We have put together what happened to the Montgomerys after they were imprisoned by looking at different records from institutions and talking to prison staff. Everyone agrees that Sutton was a good prisoner. He was quiet, followed the rules, and stayed alone. He asked for and got permission to work in the prison library, where he learned a lot about art history and anatomy. His prison notebooks, which were found after he died and are now kept in the Vermont Historical Society's sealed archives, showed that his obsession with perfecting the human form never went away. There are hundreds of detailed sketches, studies of anatomy, facial reconstructions, and designs for what he called improvements to the human form in these notebooks. He wrote commentaries on classical sculptures in the margins, often criticizing the ancient masters for being too timid when it came to sticking to natural human proportions. He wrote, "Michelangelo knew that he was fighting against the limits of being human, but even he was limited by the living. We who work with the dead don't have those kinds of limits. The dead do not complain when we make them better." Vivian had a very different experience in institutions than her husband did. At first, she was diagnosed with moral insanity, a term used in the early 1900s to describe people who knew what was right and wrong but didn't feel the need to do it. She was given a number of experimental treatments that were common at the time. Records show that she had hydrotherapy, electroshock treatments, and different drugs, but none of these seemed to change how she thought about what she did. Vivian's time at the Vermont State Hospital was especially important because of how she affected the staff. Nurse Abigail Winters, who worked on Vivian's ward from 1927 to 1936, wrote a series of private letters to her sister that were found among her things after she died in 1968. These letters showed a disturbing pattern. Mrs. Nurse Winters wrote in 1931, "Montgomery has a way of talking about beauty that makes you forget, just for a moment, what she did. She talks about the human body as if she sees something that the rest of us can't, possibilities that nature didn't plan for. After we talk, I sometimes look at people differently and see the flaws she's taught me to see." It was even more troubling that Winters wrote in a letter from 1935 that she had started bringing Vivian pictures from medical and art books that she had stolen from the hospital library. Winters wrote, "She criticizes them like a teacher would a student's work. I know I shouldn't, but the way she sees things is so interesting to me. She sees problems and opportunities that I never thought of." After the couple was arrested, the Montgomery Funeral Home closed for good. The town bought the building and tore it down in 1926, but it stayed empty for a few years. Even though the park is officially called Willow Street Park, many older people still call it Montgomery Green. Local historian Eustace Bennett wrote in the Oakvale Gazette in 1955 that the decision to turn the property into a park instead of selling it for commercial Development came from a deep-seated fear that some of the Montgomery's dark energy might still be in the building. It is said that the demolition was very thorough, with the basement and subcellar completely dug out and filled with concrete before the landscaping was done. The court ordered the destruction of the entire collection of photographs in Sutton's journal, but rumors spread that some officials had kept them because they were important to history or because they were curious. In 1964, when the attic of Judge Hiram Coolidge's old home was being renovated, a small leather case was found in a hidden compartment. This seemed to back up the rumors. Judge Coolidge had been in charge of the Montgomery trial. There were 12 pictures from the Montgomery's collection inside. They were finished portraits of their first victims in Oakville. There were also a few pages that looked like they had been ripped out of Sutton's journal. The Vermont Historical Society had these things for a short time before a court order sealed them up again. No one knows where they are right now. Doctor said that these preserved pictures showed Eleanor Simmons, who looked at them for a short time while they were at the Historical Society, was the only one who really knew how good the Montgomerys were at art and technology, no matter how twisted that vision might be. These were not the crude changes made by amateur taxidermists or the creepy trophies of crazy people, Dr. Simmons wrote in her sealed report, some of which were leaked to the Journal of Forensic Photography in 1965. These were made by people who knew a lot about human anatomy, chemistry, and how to put things together visually. The subjects had changed in ways that were both beautiful and very disturbing. Like classical sculptures coming to life, or rather, to a state beyond life. Doctor said that the pictures Simmons's description showed people posing in ways that were similar to classical art, which would be impossible for real people to do. Their features had been subtly changed. Their cheekbones were raised, their jawlines were refined, and their eyes looked bigger and brighter because the tissue around them had been chemically treated. The expressions were the most disturbing, calm but alert, with a quality that Dr. Simmons called it, an awareness that goes beyond death. The Montgomery case eventually faded from public memory, only coming up now and then in academic studies of criminal psychology or books that focus on New England's darkest histories. But in some circles, especially among mortuary science students and collectors of macabre Americana, the Undertaker artists are still very interesting. Vivian Montgomery, who was then in her 70s and still in a mental hospital, gave her only interview to Dr. Malcolm Hargrove, is a psychiatrist who studies famous criminal cases. The transcript, which came out after her death in 1961, has a scary conversation that makes it seem like the Montgomerys' work went beyond what was found in Oakville. Vivian said to Doctor, "You need to understand." Hargrove said, "Oakville was just our most recent gallery. There were others before, and there would have been more after." Doctor, art needs an audience, but it also needs to be careful. We just got careless because we were so excited about the great things Vermont gave us. Vivian is said to have smiled her usual tight smile when asked how many galleries had existed before Oakville. She said, "Enough to fill a museum, and they're still out there. You know, perfect and unchanged, waiting for someone with the vision to understand what we accomplished." Investigators followed this lead and looked into the Montgomerys' movements before they got to Vermont. Records show that they ran funeral homes in 4 other small towns in New England, each with a different name. Every business had been sold or shut down suddenly before moving to the next location between 1912 and 1918. Officials in these areas searched the old Montgomery properties, but they never found any more specimens officially. But in 1965, an anonymous letter was sent to the Boston Globe saying that during renovations of a former funeral home in New Hampshire, a hidden room had been found with preserved remains that were unlike anything else in nature. The letter, which was never proven to be real, had a detailed description that matched what the Montgomerys were known to do. The paper decided not to run the story, and official records show that no investigation was done. Some researchers have speculated that the government's unwillingness to look into possible Montgomery sites beyond Oakville is a sign of a deliberate cover-up. Doctor, in 1967, Martin Cahill wrote in the Journal of Criminal Psychology that the authorities may have thought it would be better for public morale if the Montgomerys' earlier works were not found than if they showed the full extent of their actions. In many communities, Sutton Montgomery passed away in prison in 1943 when he was 61 years old. The prison doctor's report said that his health had been getting worse for a few years, but he stayed mentally sharp until the end. Prison officials turned down his last request, which was to be able to prepare his own body for burial in a way that followed his artistic beliefs. Instead, his body was cremated because a court had ordered it years before, in case he died. This was done to make sure that his remains could not be preserved or displayed. Vivian lived for almost 20 years after her husband died. She died at the Vermont State Hospital in 1961 at the age of 79. By that time, she had become something of an institution within the institution, a living artifact of a famous case that visiting psychiatrists or criminologists would sometimes bring out to study her unusual condition. Vivian's hospital records say that she stayed mentally sharp and had strong opinions about art until the end of her life. She took up the hobby of criticizing how hospital staff and other patients looked and giving them unsolicited advice on how to improve their looks by making changes. Staff members who were interested wrote down these ideas, which Dr. Hargrove called it a disturbing catalog of possible changes to people. Vivian started making detailed drawings of what she called her ideal forms, human figures that were changed in ways that went beyond what was anatomically possible in her last year. These drawings, which are kept in the hospital's archives but have never been shown to the public, show human bodies stretched and twisted into beautiful but impossible shapes, with facial features that are more refined than what is normal for humans. Dr. Hargrove wrote in his final report on Vivian Montgomery, "She represents a unique type of criminal mind, one that has subordinated all moral considerations to a twisted aesthetic vision. Beauty is not just subjective in her world, it is also objective, and she thinks she has found its perfect form. That this form necessitates the transgression of our most revered taboos regarding the treatment of the deceased is, for her, merely an unfortunate societal limitation to be surmounted by genuine artists." There is no doubt that the Montgomerys changed how funerals were done in Vermont and nearby states. After the case, new rules were put in place that required strict record-keeping of all procedures done on the dead. Family members had the right to be there during the preparations if they wanted to, and taking pictures of the dead required clear written permission, with clear limits on how the pictures could be used. The Oakvale Cemetery is the best place to remember how the case affected people. A low stone wall separates a section in the far corner from the main burial grounds. This section is for people who died at the Montgomery Funeral Home. When the couple's crimes were found out, a lot of families chose to dig up and rebury their loved ones. They wanted funerals that were respectful and not affected by the Montgomerys. Every year, on the anniversary of the Montgomerys' arrest, there is a small ceremony at this part of the cemetery. No one speaks. No one reads the names out loud. Every year, fewer and fewer people take part because the memories of the events fade. They just put white flowers on each grave and stand in silence for a moment before leaving. As night falls, the caretaker locks the wrought iron gates of the cemetery, which ends the ceremony. He checks each lock twice, which is a tradition that started with the first caretaker after the Montgomery case and has been followed by every caretaker since. When asked why, the current caretaker, whose grandfather held the position in 1920, gives the same answer that has been passed down through generations. Some things once freed must be carefully contained. Some memories that have been disturbed need to be put to rest properly, and some doors that have been opened need to be locked twice, so that what is waiting on the other side doesn't find another way in. But the most troubling thing about the Montgomery case may not be the couple's crimes, but the effect they may have had on other people in their field. A funeral director in Maine was arrested in 1957 after families complained that their dead loved ones had been changed in strange ways. The accused killed himself before the case could go to trial, though it never did. Among his things, investigators found a secret stash of books and articles about the Montgomery case. In the same way, 2 mortuary students at a Boston technical college were kicked out in 1962 after their professor said they made very inappropriate changes to dead bodies during their final practical exam. Both are said to have praised the Montgomerys' technical advances, but they denied any plans to copy their crimes. These events, though they happened only once, make it possible that the Montgomerys' artistic vision didn't die with them, but still has a subtle effect on people who are drawn to both death work and artistic expression. This is an underground current in the funeral industry that sometimes shows up in troubling ways. As for the pictures that started it all, those creepy pictures of the dead, most of them were destroyed as the court ordered, but there are still rumors that not all of them met this end. Vermont collectors sometimes talk about private collections that have what are politely called Montgomery studies. It is still unclear whether these are real or just clever fakes made to make money off of the famous case. We do know for sure that in 1967, while workers were fixing up an old house in Burlington that used to belong to the court clerk from the Montgomery trial, they found a sealed metal box hidden in a wall. The contractor's sworn statement said that the box had a number of pictures in it that matched descriptions of the Montgomerys' work. It is said that these things went missing from the worksite before the police could get to them. A year later, an anonymous donor gave money to the Vermont Historical Society to set up a sealed archive that would record criminal innovation in the early 1900s. The donor said that the archive should stay sealed until 2020, which is 100 years after the Montgomery case. We won't know for sure if this archive has the missing photos until someone finds them. The most persistent question surrounding the Montgomery case, one that continues to haunt researchers and fascinate the morbidly curious, is how and where the couple developed their unique methods. Their technical skills and unique sense of style can't be explained by anything in their past. According to Sutton's official history, he only worked as an apprentice with a regular funeral director in Hartford, Connecticut. Vivian had no formal training in mortuary science. On their marriage certificate from 1910, it said that she had worked as a photographer's assistant, but the methods they used in Oakville needed a lot more advanced knowledge of chemistry, anatomy, and preservation than what was normal for the time. Chemists from the University of Vermont looked at the things they found in their workroom in 1921. They found compounds that were not easy to find and preservation methods that one expert said were at least 20 years ahead of current mortuary science. This inconsistency has prompted certain researchers to formulate theories regarding potential mentors or collaborators who may have introduced the Montgomerys to their macabre artistic expression. Dr. In his 1967 paper, Cahill proposed the existence of an underground network of individuals engaged in post-mortem modifications during the early 20th century, citing analogous instances in Europe, especially in Germany and Austria, from 1890 to 1910. It is still unclear who taught the Montgomerys, or if they learned their skills on their own through trial and error. But the question of who they might have taught during their time in business is even more troubling. Dr. Vivian hinted at this possibility to Hargrove. When someone asked her if she and Sutton were the only ones who did mortuary arts in a certain way, she reportedly laughed and said, "Art movements need followers. Doctor, Da Vinci didn't end the Renaissance, and our vision won't end with us." The idea that the Montgomerys may have shared their methods with others, leaving a legacy that could show up in any funeral home, still bothers those who study their case. Even after a lot of research, no solid proof of such followers has ever been found. However, the idea remains a dark footnote to an already disturbing part of criminal history. Another aspect of the Montgomery case that hasn't gotten much attention is how the small-town setting where their crimes happened played a role. With a population of less than 1,000, Oakville was the perfect place for the Montgomerys to do their work. It was close-knit enough to provide a steady stream of subjects, but far enough away from other people to avoid being watched. Sociologist Doctor said, "Small towns work on trust." Francis Weiber's 1966 study of the case, residents know each other well enough that personal connections are often more important than credentials. Once they are accepted, new people like the Montgomerys can work with little supervision, especially in jobs that most people don't want to look too closely at. The time period made this situation worse. In 1919 and 1920, Oakville, like many other American towns, was still dealing with the effects of World War I and the flu pandemic. Death was a common sight, and people may have been less likely to question the details of funeral customs at a time when death rates were already high. The Montgomerys took advantage of a grieving community, Dr. Weber wrote. They knew that when people are sad, they are more likely to believe comforting lies and less likely to question things. They used the trust that small-town funeral directors usually have against them. The way the Montgomery Funeral Home was set up made it easier for them to do their business without being seen. According to architectural plans found during the investigation, the Montgomerys made major changes to the building soon after they bought it. For example, they added soundproofing materials to the walls of the preparation room and built a hidden sub-cellar. The building was meant to hide, Doctor said. Reynolds talked to the Vermont Quarterly in 1952. The way the rooms were set up made it easy to tell which ones were public and which ones were private. The preparation room and dark room were placed to give the most privacy. The way the windows are placed, small, high, and with heavy curtains, makes it look like they were meant to keep people from seeing in. This architectural secrecy also included the Montgomerys' living quarters. The couple lived on the second floor of the funeral home. It was divided into two parts: a regular living room that visitors could see, and a private study that could only be accessed through a secret door that looked like a bookcase. The sheriff's raid found this study, which had the couple's personal journals, technical manuals, and a collection of anatomical drawings that showed how their art form had changed over time. Sheriff Sullivan is said to have told a coworker in 1966 that the study was a window into their minds. Everything was carefully arranged: technical diagrams, drawings, and photos. It was all very cold and precise, which was somehow more disturbing than if it had been messy. In the usual sense, they weren't crazy. They were planned and methodical. They used this methodical way of picking their subjects as well. The FBI looked at Montgomery's records in 1960 as part of a larger study of strange criminal patterns. They found that Montgomery did not randomly choose their specimens. They seemed to have standards, physical traits, that they thought would give them the best chance of improving their specific type of enhancement. The FBI report said they liked certain features, such as high cheekbones, long fingers, and graceful proportions. In some cases, they seemed to have actively looked for certain types of people, offering families of the dead people who had the traits they wanted lower prices on their services. This selective method helps us understand why some bodies got the full transformation treatment while others were treated in a more standard way. It also suggests that they planned their crimes in advance, which goes against earlier ideas that the Montgomerys might have accidentally committed them by breaking the rules at work little by little. Howard Matthews, a criminologist, wrote in 1964 that these weren't crimes of opportunity. The Montgomerys came to Oakville with a clear idea of what they wanted to do. Everything they did, from changing the building to how they ran their business, was meant to help them achieve their true goal. The funeral business wasn't their job, it was their cover. There has been a lot of research into the couple's lives before they moved to Oakville, but there are still some big gaps. Records show that Sutton Montgomery was born in 1,882 inches western Massachusetts to a family that didn't have a lot of money. Sutton may have learned about mortuary practices at a young age because his father was a cabinet maker who made furniture for the funeral industry, like coffins, viewing tables, and display cases. It's harder to tell where Vivian came from. Records first show her name, Vivian Lockage Montgomery, in 1910, when she married Sutton in a small ceremony in New Hampshire. Researchers think that Vivian Lockage may have used a fake name because they have never found any birth certificates or other records from before her birth. Margaret Hayes, a genealogist, wrote in an article for the New England Historical Society Journal in 1967, "The absence of records is telling. In that time, a woman not having any records of her birth, school, or census entries suggests that she was trying to hide her past on purpose. What was she trying to hide?" Dr. Cahill's thorough study of the case in 1967 suggests that Vivian may have studied medical illustration or anatomical modeling in Europe before meeting Sutton. This would explain both her technical skills and the European influences that can be seen in the Montgomerys' artistic style. Doctor said, "Some of the techniques the Montgomerys used, especially in their facial reconstructions, are very similar to those developed in Vienna and Berlin in the early 1900s. Cahill wrote. These were not techniques that were taught in American mortuary schools at the time. Sutton's journal entries about V's continental methods and techniques perfected in the Old World back up this European link. There has never been any solid proof that Vivian was in Europe or that she got any formal training there. Business records, property deeds, and local newspaper archives have helped to piece together what the Montgomerys did between their marriage in 1910 and their arrival in Oakville in 1919. They ran funeral homes in 4 places during this time: Lakeville, Connecticut, 1,912, 1,914, Tarrytown, New York, 1,914, 1,916, Bedford, New Hampshire, 1,916, 1,917, and briefly, in Rockport, Massachusetts, 1,917, 1,919. In each community, they did the same thing. They bought a funeral home that was already running, ran it for about 2 years, then sold the property and moved on. Public records show that they were well liked in these communities and that there were no complaints or strange events during their time there. But after what was found in Oakville, researchers have naturally wondered if their earlier work might have included similar activities that went unnoticed. Robert Turner, an FBI analyst, said in the 1960 report, "The mobility itself is suspicious. To run a successful funeral home, you usually need to be involved in the community and build long-term relationships." The Montgomerys' habit of moving around a lot goes against the norm in the industry and suggests that they may have moved whenever they thought their real activities were at risk of being found out. Investigating the Montgomerys' old properties hasn't gotten them very far. In most cases, the buildings were changed a lot or torn down by later owners long before the authorities were interested in looking at them. In 1922, a fire destroyed the Tarrytown location, and in 1925, the Bedford property was turned into a medical clinic after major renovations that would have made any hidden spaces or structural changes impossible. When investigators looked into it, they found that only the Rockport location was mostly intact. Authorities found a locked room in the basement in 1965 that looked like it had been used as a photography studio. There were signs that specialized lighting fixtures and darkroom equipment had been put in and then taken out, but there was no physical proof of preserved remains or pictures. The investigation into the Montgomerys' past actions was made even harder by the deaths of important witnesses. When police started to look into their past in the 1960 seconds, a lot of the people who knew the couple when they were working together had already died or moved away. People who stayed behind often only had hazy memories of the quiet, professional undertakers who had worked in their towns decades earlier. One exception was Dr. Samuel Whitaker, who had served as the town physician in Bedford during the Montgomerys' time there. In a sworn statement from 1964, he talked about an event that had seemed strange to him at the time but not scary. "I was called to the funeral home one evening in the winter of 1917 to sign a death certificate for an elderly man who had died at home," he recalled. "When I arrived, I found Mr. Say. Montgomery was working late in the room where they were getting ready. That wasn't strange, but I did notice that he had a strange set of tools, laid-out tools that looked more like they were for sculpting than for embalming. When I asked, he told me they were special tools for reconstructing faces because the person who died had hurt their face badly in a fall. At the time, I believed this explanation, but now that we know more, I wonder if I saw something more evil." Even though these testimonies were suggestive, they didn't give the authorities enough proof to say for sure that the Montgomerys had been doing their strange things before they moved to Oakville. One of the many unanswered questions about the case is what they were doing before. The Montgomery case had a huge and long-lasting effect on the people of Oakville. In 1955, psychologist Eliza Thornton interviewed people in Oakville as part of a study on community trauma. She wrote about what she called a persistent undercurrent of anxiety that still affected the town decades after the events. The violation was not only of the deceased, but also of the trust of the community, Thornton wrote in her findings, published in the Journal of Community Psychology in 1956. Residents described a lingering sense of betrayal, the feeling that they had welcomed and trusted individuals who had used that trust to commit unspeakable acts right under their noses. This betrayal hurt a lot more for people whose family members had been cared for by the Montgomerys. The uncertainty about which dead person had been treated with respect and which had been changed by the couple's art made things difficult. Thornton called ambiguous grief, a condition where the normal process of mourning is complicated by unanswerable questions. Not knowing became its own torment, she wrote. Many families chose to exhume and rebury their loved ones rather than live with the uncertainty. But even this provided incomplete closure. The question was still there. What had been done before the reburial? And what changes had been made that might never be undone? The dead had been hurt, and so had the living who loved them. The town's response to this trauma was different for everyone. Most importantly, Oakville developed what sociologists call a culture of vigilance, which made people more aware of outsiders and strange behaviors for generations. Records from the town show that, between 1921 and 1950, Oakville turned down many applications from professionals who wanted to start businesses in the area, especially those in the medical or death-related fields. In his 1955 article, local historian Bennett said, "The town became insular. New residents were watched closely, almost to the point of hostility. Newcomers had to show that they could be trusted through years of observed behavior, not just credentials and references." In the years after the Montgomery case, Oakville's economy got worse because it was so isolated. During the post-war period, other towns welcomed new businesses and grew, but Oakville stayed the same. Its population slowly dropped as younger residents moved to places that were more welcoming. By 1960, the town had a bad reputation across Vermont as a place that didn't like strangers, which made it even less appealing to people and businesses who might want to move there. The community didn't start to open up to outside influences again until the late 1960s, when the generation that had lived through the events started to fade. The psychological effects also affected how funerals were held. After the Montgomery case, people in Oakville preferred to have funerals at home instead of hiring professionals for many years. Families usually chose funeral homes in nearby towns when they needed professional services, even though this was often very inconvenient and expensive. It took more than 30 years after the Montgomery case for the first funeral home to open in Oakville. It didn't open until 1952. Harold Jenkins, the owner, took extreme steps to earn the trust of the community, such as allowing family members to see every step of the preparation process in full view. "I understand their fears," Jenkins said in an interview with the Oakville Gazette in 1952. "I don't want them to forget what happened. I'm here to show them that they can care for their dead with respect and dignity. All of the doors in my business are open. Anyone can watch every procedure. I don't have anything to hide because I don't do anything that needs to be hidden." Eventually, the community came around to this openness. However, Jenkins said that even in the 1960 seconds, some older residents refused to use his services because they didn't want to trust another professional with their loved one's funeral arrangements. The Montgomery case has had a cultural impact that goes far beyond the borders of Oakville. Academics look at it as a one-of-a-kind case of what criminologists call aesthetic criminality, which means doing illegal things, not for money, sex, or anger, but for a twisted artistic vision. Dr. wrote, "The Montgomerys are a rare type of criminal." Leonard Pratt wrote the book Criminal Psychology, A Modern Approach in 1968. They did what they did not out of passion or for money, but to serve an aesthetic ideal that most people find disgusting. This gap between how they see themselves as artists and how the public sees them as desecrators makes it hard to help them get better. This part of the case has made it a common topic of conversation about the limits of art and morality. The question of whether something can be both artistically accomplished and morally wrong, or whether technical skill and aesthetic vision can exist without moral considerations, is still a topic of debate in philosophy of art classes. The Montgomerys are often used as an extreme example. In popular culture, the details of the Montgomery case aren't well known outside of Vermont and true crime circles, but you can see their impact in many works of fiction. In the 1960 seconds and 1970 seconds, a number of horror movies had Undertaker characters who secretly wanted to be artists with their clients. Raymond Carter's 1964 book, The Quiet Ones, which is never directly linked to the Montgomerys, has a similar couple running a funeral home in rural New England who are found to have been changing bodies for artistic reasons. True crime podcasts and documentaries have brought the case back into the public eye more recently. The 1968 Vermont Public Radio show, The Undertaker Artists, was one of the first in-depth looks at the case that the general public could listen to. When it was re-released in 2018, the remastered version became one of the station's most popular shows to download. People are interested in the Montgomerys not just because of their crimes, but also because their case brings up philosophical questions about death, art, and bodily autonomy. The essential inquiry, who possesses the human body post-mortem, persists in modern discourse regarding funeral customs, organ donation, and the exhibition of human remains in medical and artistic settings. Doctors said the Montgomerys broke not only the law, but also cultural taboos that exist in almost all human societies. Simmons gave her final opinion on the case. How we treat the dead is one of our most important moral issues. But the unsettling truth is that they made a lot of progress in technology. They came up with ways to preserve bodies that even today's mortuary science would think are new. This uncomfortable mix of technical genius and moral depravity is what makes their case so disturbing. Plans for events in Vermont to honor the 100th anniversary of the Montgomery case in 2020 have caused a lot of debate. Some people say that the case should get more academic attention, because it was an important event in history that still has an impact on discussions about professional ethics and community trust. Some people say that these kinds of events could make the Montgomerys' crimes seem more appealing and hurt the victims' descendants again. The Vermont Historical Society has announced a small show for December 2020. It will focus on the changes in laws and rules that happened because of the case, not on the Montgomerys themselves or their work. It is still unclear if the sealed archive set up by the anonymous donor in 1968, which is supposed to stay closed until 2020, will be opened as part of this memorial. The case of the Undertaker couple will always be on our minds because it brings up our deepest fears about death and what happens to us after we die. The dead are vulnerable because they can't protect themselves from being desecrated or used inappropriately. This is like how vulnerable we are at the end of our lives. The Montgomerys took advantage of this weakness to further their sick sense of style. They not only violated the bodies of the dead, but also the trust of the living who had given them those bodies to care for. This double betrayal of both the dead and those who are grieving them breaks the sacred contract that lets communities work, a contract that assumes that professionals will use their specialized knowledge for good instead of harm. The story of the Undertaker couple from 1920 is a disturbing reminder of how easy it is for the line between professional care and artistic obsession to get blurry when human remains become objects of fascination instead of things that deserve respect. It makes us think about how we deal with death in our culture and how much we trust the people who take care of our loved ones when they are at their most vulnerable. The thought that haunted Oakville residents for decades after the case was closed is probably the most disturbing. How many other small towns' funeral homes might have similar secrets? How many other professionals see the dead not as sacred beings to be respected, but as raw material for their own art? And how would we know until it was too late? As you think about this documented case, keep in mind this last unsettling detail. As ordered by the court, Sutton Montgomery's body was cremated after he died in prison in 1943. This was done to make sure that no one could keep his remains in any way. However, when the police came to get Vivian Montgomery's body after she died in 1961, the hospital staff told them something strange. At the time of her death, her hands, which had been gnarled by arthritis in her last years, seemed to have temporarily regained the elegant, long look that witnesses had said they saw on her perfected subjects. The doctor who was there at the time said it was just a trick of light and shadow. However, the night nurse, who died in 1968, wrote in a private letter that was found among her things after her death, "I have seen many deaths in my career. I know what happens to the body when life leaves. What I saw with Mrs. Montgomery was a whole different story. For a brief time, her hands weren't hers. They belonged to something that had been waiting patiently inside her for all those years. Something that knew, just like she did, that death is not an end, but a change." The Montgomery case's legacy goes far beyond Oakville and the crimes that happened there. It acts as a dark mirror that shows how we all feel about death, art, and the limits of trust in professionals. The Undertaker's job has always been at the awkward crossroads of life and death, science and ritual, and body and spirit. The Montgomerys took advantage of that crossroads for their own gain, turning what should have been a holy duty into a chance for personal artistic expression. Their story shows us that sometimes the scariest monsters aren't supernatural beings hiding in the dark, but regular people who see the world through a lens so warped that they think acts of desecration are acts of creation. The Montgomery case's quiet horror doesn't come from gore or violence. It comes from the cold, careful turning of care into exploitation. This is a reminder that true darkness often hides behind the most respectable facades, waiting for the chance to turn what we love into something we don't recognize.